How's it going, class? This is going to be the fifth and final lecture of this test series, this test grouping. Remember that we have two exams in the course, so this will be the final lecture for the first exam. Again, like I said in my last little bonus lecture, if you have not started studying yet, I highly recommend doing that, as well as coming up here soon. If you're watching this in sequence and in the weeks that you should be watching this in the coming weeks, I'm going to be posting a little Quizlet or a scheduling planner so that we can decide what time we want to do the Zoom review session. Being as I posted these bonus lectures and I've gone over the material a couple times in greater detail, I probably won't have a lot prepared for you guys. I'll be going over a study guide that I'll be producing at that time. But more of what that Zoom review session is going to be is for you guys to ask me questions and go through concepts so that you can understand the material. And remember, like I've said before, if you're not understanding this, somebody else probably isn't understanding it too. And I'm not going to make you feel dumb for any of the questions that you ask. I want you guys to ask me anything that you think might be pertinent to your future education. I'm going to do my best to help you out. I'm by no means an expert, but I've been teaching this for 4 years now. So hopefully, if you do have questions, I'm able to help you out. And if not, at least I'll point you to the right resource to figure out what you need. But we'll get going on the fifth lecture here. If you had happened to watch this lecture before, I'm actually redoing this lecture because I didn't really like how I went over it last time. So this is going to be redoing the fifth lecture. You don't have to watch either. If you already watched the first one, you don't have to rewatch this one because the content's going to be the same. I just think that I'll be able to present this material to you in a little bit better way now that I've kind of done it once before. So I'm redoing it for you guys, so it's a little better. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen with you here. Oh, excuse me, share my screen with you here, and we'll start our lecture. So we are looking at principles of designing training programs. And this is not my favorite chapter for this because I just feel like this is not a huge part of an exercise physiology course. I think we should be talking a lot more about the anatomy and physiology, what's occurring when you're moving and when you're doing different things. But for the basis of the textbook that I'm forced to use, this is chapter 5, and this is what we have to go over because it's going to kind of project you and leapfrog you into what we'll be going over in the next testing category for exam 2. And so first, remember the goal of any training program is adaptation. We're trying to improve. So by adaptation, we mean improvements, right? And you improve by going through adaptation. It's a process by which various changes in the body enable to adjust to new environments or a new condition. And we've all seen this before. As you lift, your muscles get bigger. As you spend more time, let's say in the heat here in Florida, you get used to the heat, you get used to the humidity. I would imagine, even though you've lived here your entire lives, you're still not fully used to it. When it's 95 and super humid out, I'm sure it's still not super enjoyable. Especially me being from North Dakota, it's not my favorite. I've gotten a little bit more used to it than when I moved down here. But that is a form of adaptation. We should all know what adaptation is if we've taken a biology course. This is the fitness fatigue paradigm. So essentially what this is saying is every training bout creates both fitness and fatigue, which summates to create preparedness. So on the right here, we see this graph here. You're at a steady baseline level. You go through fatigue. High training loads result in both elevated fatigue and fitness levels. So you go through fatigue. If you're working out harder, this is going to be a greater drop, essentially. This isn't like an exact number that it's dropping. This is just kind of an abstract way of you looking at it. And if you're doing a minimal load, you're going to have less of a drop here. But remember that fatigue dissipates faster than fitness. So what they mean is fitness is your ability to do something. So your ability to, excuse me, I said that wrong. So fitness is just has nothing to do with your ability to complete a load. And so with fatigue, right, fatigue is going to go away much more quickly. So we have this drop. And then you have this recovery phase here. You have what they call the resistance phase. Recovery phase is better. And it brings you up to a higher baseline. So we see 3, that baseline is higher than it is over here. And then you repeat it and go on and so on and so forth. And this is essentially the stepwise manner where you use fatigue to elicit some sort of reaction to cause adaptation in the body and make you stronger or better able to handle that stimulus going forward. So for these programs, you have key variables, the fit principle, variables that can be manipulated. Frequency, so how many days per week, per month you are working out, even maybe how many times per day. Intensity, so intensity is the percent of maximal weight, speed, heart rate, VO2. So essentially that's the objective amount of work or subjective to you amount of work that you are doing. So you are lifting 85% of your 1RM for 3 times. You are running at 70% of your VO2 max. Volume, which we'll talk about, um, is also something that we could talk about here, right? Volume is the amount of it that you're doing. So that kind of has to do with frequency, how many days per week, how much of each individual rep you are doing. Volume intensity usually go hand in hand because as intensity goes up, volume will go down. So time, the duration of the sets, and the rest periods, that has a lot to do with volume itself, and then the type of exercise. So you make sure you want to be doing exercise variation. That's why you see these bodybuilders are doing crazy different exercises because they've done the standard exercises so much. They need to provide some sort of variation, in essence, to shock the muscles. We've all heard the shock the muscles from the Arnold Schwarzenegger thing before. In the way that he teaches it, it's not necessarily the right way, where you're doing weird stuff and you're like smacking the muscle as you're doing it, and you're watching television, and then you're watching a computer game, like crazy stuff that they come up with. But there is an essence, and there is a lot of truth in the fact that you need to provide differing stimuluses to the muscles in order to continue to see adaptation. So the 5 principles of program design, we're going to have individuality, specificity, reversibility, progressive overload, and variation. We'll go into those in a little bit more detail now. So individuality has to do with genetic variations in cell growth rates, metabolism, fiber type, and cardiorespiratory and neuroendocrine regulation. So all these things within the body that summate to your adaptation are things that are going to be different for each individual. So for those of you who have really good genetics, good for you. Individuals that are top of their sport, LeBron James, Michael Phelps, Tom Brady, right? Whatever it might be, Aaron Rodgers. They all have very good genetic ability to go through adaptation and to grow and become better, as well as they probably are extremely, insanely devoted human beings to their craft. So that makes them better as well. But a lot of it comes from genetics. You get this change, or you get this differing ability for your body to adapt to a stimulus and adapt either more robustly or in a diminished manner, is going to affect how the training progresses for you individually, right? And then culture and environment and interests. So if you were in a culture where you need to be prevalent in some nature, there's a push in a certain culture for you to be smart, or the push in a certain culture for you to be athletically inclined, or for you to be a caregiver, or whatever it might be, whatever the culture is pushing you to do, that's going to be individual to you yourself, as well as how you perceive that. I know growing up, my dad always pushed very hard about just being a hardworking individual. And he obviously, my parents strive for me to be intelligent too. But him specifically just wanted you to be a hard-working person. So I grew up with a lot of morals that were based on hard work, and carrying in my adult lifestyle. I'm not sure if it's carried over as much as he wishes it would, but I can see myself compared to a lot of other individuals, and I see how much I value other people that work hard compared to some other person, let's say, that values other people for a different reason. And that has to do with the culture that I was raised in. It has to do with how I perceive that culture, and that's going to change how I manifest or how I change throughout a training program. And talking about our environment here, and then your interests. Obviously, if you're more interested in something, you're likely going to be more adept or more willing to put a lot of extra time into it. So remember, genetics determines our starting point, and our rate and magnitude of adaptation. So we see here we have 4 different people going on. We have our high fitness. We have our high fitness individuals. So we have 2 high fitness individuals, but we see here there's a difference between the two, and what it is whether or not they are a responder. So, or a high or low responder, I mean. So this individual in the purplish, whatever color that is, don't ask me, whatever color that is, that individual not only has high initial fitness, but they also are a high responder to exercise. So the mechanisms within the body that we aren't going to dive super deep into, but the mechanisms within the body that change and replenish and move them to a more adapted state are more fit and are more efficient at their jobs. And I mean, we're not going to talk about this for this lecture. We're going to talk about it later on in the year. But we look at the person in the orange here and we see that even maybe with the same exact training load, they just are not adapting in the same manner. And so just because somebody's going through the same training, or just because someone is prescribing a certain training, doesn't mean that it's going to have the same effect on individuals. And that's the big problem with exercise prescription, is just because it works for you does not mean that it'll work for somebody else. And that's why a lot of standard basic training programs are very, very standardized and generalizable, because you need to hit the basics. And then with proper athlete monitoring, you can find what's their baseline and find what their level of adaptation is, and kind of monitor and train training programs to that individual. And then obviously we see here low training, and we see the different jumps here. But as well, we're kind of seeing that even if you have low initial fitness, if you happen to be a high responder, your body's very adaptive, you can get yourself up near or up to the same level as people who have high initial fitness. So this is that hard work beats talent when talent doesn't work hard idea, right? The hard work, if you are a high responder, can get you up near the top. But again, if you have high initial fitness, good genetics, and you're a hard worker, that's what separates the premier athletes from some of the lesser athletes. So we look at a few different individuals here, right? Our Kenyan distance runner, bunch of different factors for him, right? His heredity, training history, geography, anatomy, fiber type, diet, motivation. So his heredity, right? He obviously has good genetics for running long distance. He probably has better ability to diffuse oxygen across the alveoli and across the basal membrane in the muscle, probably more red blood cells, more hemoglobin groups, a whole bunch of different things, as well as a better ability to adapt and to provide force throughout the running thing. And then his training history, obviously, we all know that the Kenyan distance runners are very prevalent in the Olympic sports because they have a genetic predisposition, as well as they have good coaches over there. So they understand how to get people to their peak performance. Geography, depending on whether you're training high or training low in certain atmospheres, how you're adapting to those atmospheres. Anatomy, we know that long distance runners are generally relatively small human beings. If you are born very, very tall, it makes it more difficult for you to be a long distance runner because you're mechanically disadvantaged. If you are able to naturally put on greater muscle mass, or you have higher type 2 fiber distribution, it's not going to be as prevalent to see you in a long distance sport. And you look at like diet, motivation, right? A bunch of different things that we know affect your ability to exercise. Or Ed Cohen, a power lifter, 71 world records in powerlifting. Again, for him, he probably has a higher distribution of type 2 muscle fibers. His heredity probably allows him to ingest, digest, and process more protein, allowing his muscles to grow. The satellite cells in his muscle are probably better able to differentiate, more quickly differentiate to provide muscle repair than other individuals. And then diet, motivation, there's all sorts of things that might be different for these individuals that might put them on one end of the spectrum versus the other end of the spectrum. With this individuality, we're talking about the law of diminishing returns. So this is essentially just a graph that's showing your change or your growth over time. And you see here at the beginning, we have this initial jump, this really high peak. This is people will talk about newbie gains. I have a good friend of mine. He was just talking to me saying, "Hey, newbie gains are real," and I was like, "I know they're real. You know, this is what I teach on. This is what I do research on." But that happens to be a lot of the neuromuscular junctions. So if you're wondering what that is, when you get into the weight room and you see massive improvements in the first 6 to 8 weeks, really what that is that is neural incline. So you're getting better synergistic muscle firing. Your nerves are firing more in concentrated detail and in synergism. Most of the adaptations you are seeing in the first 6 to 8 weeks of a training program are specifically neuromuscular and base. They're not really occurring actually within the muscle. You're not laying down more muscle tissue. You're not getting stronger muscles quite yet. Most of the gains are specifically from the neuromuscular area. And as that begins to peter out, as you begin to see the neuromuscular training begin to diminish, you begin to see this drop off because now you're relying on muscular adaptation. And muscular adaptation is a long-term process. It takes a while for that to occur. So I know a lot of people look at bodybuilders and they think, you know, why? What for? Like that it's not that cool, that just they're too big. For them, a lot of them, what it is it's a challenge. It is extremely hard to get that big. And if you look at the guys that juice, you guys that are taking steroids, which is a good portion of them, even with the help from the steroids, it takes them a rigorous training cycle, diet. They're not consuming any toxins like alcohol or any sorts of drugs. They are themselves very, very disciplined to their craft because as they get closer to their genetic potential here, you see that even with years and years of training, you're barely increasing at all. And that's basically essentially what your genetic potential is. You can reach your genetic potential with years of training, but at some point there's a ceiling and you're not able to go any higher. So our second term, our second idea that we're looking at here is our term of specificity. And so specificity is talking about the adaptations are specific to the muscles trained, the intensity of the exercise performed, and the metabolic demands of exercise, and the joint angle trained. So you need to train specific to your sport. Except for actual practice of sport, no conditioning program has 100% carryover. So to maximize your carryover, you're going to want to choose movements and intensities that are very, very specific to your sport. That's why you see a lot of sports use a squat, because you use your legs in pretty much every single sport. You see people doing sprints and stuff like that. Let's say for a long distance runner, you're probably not going to spend a lot of time doing sprinting because that's not very specific to your sport. And with this model, what blows my mind is that my former university, the University of North Dakota, there was a lot of this specificity missed. And even more so in my high school era, when we were playing football, a very, very explosive, high velocity sport, when we were in their weight room, our strength coaches were telling us to move the weight as slowly as possible. And as you can imagine, we weren't very good because the training that we were doing was not preparing us for sport. It was preparing us to move heavy weights very slowly. And when in football do you move something very slowly ever? You don't. Same thing with sprinting. If you want to get better at sprinting, what do? You do a lot of sprinting. You don't do slow movements. You're going to mix those in. Now, don't say this is like you should never be doing those things. You're going to mix those in because those are fundamental properties of fitness and they are going to help you out to a certain capacity. But as you get to a higher level, you need to be specific in your training. Do you want to have high velocity movement in your sport? You have to train high velocity movement in the training programs. Do you want to be able to have high oxygen delivery and long duration exercise in your sport? You need to have high oxygen delivery and long duration exercise in your training. So performance testing must also be based to both training and performance. So when you're doing testing, when you're analyzing these athletes, you want to make sure that not only are you testing them and testing the things that you want to test, but those things that you are testing should also be an exercise. So if you're testing somebody's mile time, you want to make sure that they're working hard during that mile time, which seems obvious, but the idea of validity is sometimes lost. People are going, okay. I've heard many of the women that I went to college with talk about volleyball in high school, and they always complained about how one of the criteria to join the volleyball team is they had to run a mile in like under 10 minutes or something like that. And they're like, that has nothing to do with volleyball, whatever. And they're right, it has nothing to do with volleyball, but it also does show a baseline of fitness and why that test might not be very valid to your volleyball skill. It's somewhat valid to your overall fitness level. And that's why a lot of high schools do it. I'm not saying that I endorse that activity. I'm just saying that some coaches would see that as, oh, they ran a really good mile time. That means that they're probably going to be better at volleyball. Maybe, maybe not. And then you still need general training conditioning for novices at different times of year. So when you have people that are highly involved and they're highly acute and elite athletes, you still want general training periods. You don't want to take them completely out. And as well as for individual athletes, like we talked about individuality, you have that huge spike right away. I remember a strength coach that we had used to say, any idiot can train any idiot for 6 weeks. It's true. You can really prescribe any training to somebody for 6 weeks and you're going to see big gains. So after that, you really separate the knowledgeable individuals from the people who are hacks, and that you can figure out what is the best way to continue to see that adaptation. So with this too, you're going to look at a needs analysis. So what are their needs analysis for their sport? Is it for sport again? And then is it for general population? Is it for somebody who's just trying to walk? Is it for somebody who's trying to be more active? Or somebody who's trying to cut down on body fat because they're having metabolic issues, because they're obese, whatever it might be, you're going to cut these things down. And you're also going to cut them down for movements. So specifically for certain movements, what is the physiology of that movement? And what is the biomechanical nature of that movement? And here we're looking at metabolic specificity. So again, you're looking at how you're training. So if you're going to run a 400 meter dash, what are you relying on? What energy system are you relying on? Well, we see here, you're relying heavily on the phosphagen system. Right, 400 meter dash, you're having really heavily on the phosphagen system and on anaerobic endurance. This is the total amount of ATP being produced. So again, the phosphagen system is only active for the first few seconds, even though a 400 meter dash is about 50 seconds long if you're really quick. And then the last 15% of the ATP, but for the duration of that run, you're actually using a lot more of the anaerobic system because the phosphagen system is burned out. But this is just telling you the total amount of ATP. But still, it shows you what two energy systems are the most important to train for that bout. And then we look at a marathon runner, you're going to spend a lot of your time training the aerobic endurance, right? You're going to be training a lot of time training the oxidative system, making that is highly developed so that when you want to do your exercise going forward, that is what is the focus of your training for your athlete. So an aerobic athlete, you're going to want to increase VO2 max and lactate threshold. So if we're increasing VO2 max, we're increasing the ability of the body to consume oxygen and produce ATP. We're going to see higher performance output, and we're going to see more performance output over time, as well as our lactate threshold. As we should remember, once you reach lactate threshold, you begin to fatigue very, very rapidly. And so if you have an individual who's reaching lactate threshold, excuse me, an individual who's reaching lactate threshold at 6.5 miles an hour versus somebody who's reaching lactate threshold at 7.0 miles per hour, the individual that is second that reaches that individual or that reaches that lactate threshold at 7.0 miles per hour is able to maintain a higher pace without fatiguing as quickly. And those are two different functions or fundamental aspects of aerobic training that you are going to want to modulate and try to train. As well as with this, we're going to see increased cardiac output. So if you're increasing cardiac output, you're getting higher oxygen delivery, as well as we talked about before with fatigue or blood flow. If you're increasing this AVO2 difference, if you're increasing the muscle's ability to actually extract the oxygen from the arterial circuit, from the capillaries themselves, you're going to have a better ability to process that oxygen. And then we have a shift to type 1 fibers. So in aerobic athletes, they shift towards type 1 fibers, and it makes sense. If you're not doing a lot of type 2 fiber work, you're not spending a lot of time being anaerobic, why would we need to keep building those fibers? They're going to begin to shift. You're going to begin to have mitochondria pop up, become more efficient in those type 2 fibers, and they're going to begin to shift towards type 1 fibers. As well as you're going to see improved efficiency and economy, and you're going to minimize injury and imbalance. That just has to come with you becoming more trained at your craft. You don't really think about it, but let's say a cyclist here, right? The way in which he pedals and the way in which he applies pressure and effort throughout the race is a craft. It's very, very specialized, and it's very, very calculated in order to provide the best chance for that individual to win that race. So anaerobic athletes, if you want to work with them, your goal is going to be to increase strength, power, speed, and potentially hypertrophy. So you're going to rely a lot on neural adaptations, like I talked about before, getting that increased synergy, as well as you're trying to improve speed and agility and coordination. So we look at Shohei Ohtani. He's one of the only people in the MLB that both throws and hits. A very, very talented individual, won an MVP last year, I believe. It's just not very common to see somebody who can dedicate enough time to pitching and hitting and be actually rather successful in both. So for that, both of those things, both throwing and swinging, require high velocity of movement. And so those are things that you're going to want to train on that individual. So we see here with somebody who is, if we're looking at energy expenditure, so training duration, okay, on the left here, strength improvement, the strength group, energy expended for the concurrent group. So we're seeing here is that somebody who is in a strength group in the concurrent group for energy expended, they're going to continue to expend high amounts of energy, okay? But with strength improvements, right? Strength improvements, if you are in a strength group, you're going to see lower energy expended. And so what we're saying here is that with energy, if you are an individual, okay, if you are an individual that is still expending high amounts of energy for any sort of movement, you are probably going to see diminished strength improvement. But for those who are working specifically in training protocols, their strength is continuing to improve, if we see here with these white dots, and our energy expended is not nearly as high. And so when you go through a strength training program, the next time you come to do something that's really heavy, it doesn't require as much energy, which means that you can provide some sort of greater output for your sport. So looking at this for specificity as well, looking at the biomechanical analysis of 5 steps. So we want to divide the activity in temporal phases, identify the joints involved in the movements occurring at those joints, determine the type of muscular action, identify instances where rapid joint angle accelerations are occurring, identify any extremes of joint range of motion. So essentially what you're trying to do is you are trying to model and map that movement so that you know what's really, really important. So let's say for a baseball player here, you see the leg lifts, we see the leg lift here, and then we see the drive, the slide. So you're going to want to make sure that this back leg is very, very powerful. Sorry, my pen skipped there. This back leg needs to be very, very powerful to allow you to push off. This front leg doesn't need to be as powerful because it's just meant for stability. You're landing on that front leg and essentially driving off the back leg to provide force through your upper body, through the frontal kinetic chain, into the arms so that you can throw the ball hard like this. And I apologize because the GIF keeps looping here. As well as we look at this, look at the flexibility here in his arm. Look at that extreme range of motion. You're going to want to make sure that not only are you flexible enough to do that, but also something that's often lost in sport is, are you flexible enough to do it? Yes or no. And are you flexible and strong enough in that extreme range of motion? There's plenty of guys that can whip their arms like that, but what you see a lot is that guys that whip their arm back really, really far tend to have problems like UCL issues, which is what Tommy John's is. So if you are not strong enough to be in that range of motion while applying force, that is also detrimental. And then we look here at the follow through. Obviously, they're following through with their right arm, and we need muscles here to eccentrically decelerate the arm. So there's different training things here. How you're going to train the right arm is slightly different than how you would train the back of the right arm versus how you train the right leg is going to be slightly different than how you would train the left leg. And this is an extreme example, but this is showing how different parts of a movement that seem to be just part of the sport need to be trained differently, as well as you can look at walking. You can break this down in temporal phases. You can look at somebody who may be going through rehab and saying, okay, where are they breaking down? Are they breaking down in the mid stance phase? Are they breaking down in the pre-swing, the initial swing, whatever it might be? You can look at this biomechanical breakdown of their gait and say, okay, where are they breaking down? When they're breaking down and they're not as efficient in that part of the walk, what are the muscles that are activated? And therefore, then we can train those muscles, or we can do something to help them become better in their gait. As well as you look at the planes, axis, and points of rotation. Sorry, your axis of rotation. So you can think about these in a few different ways. So the sagittal plane, I like to think of these as you are looking at if a pane of glass was cut through your body. So the sagittal plane is anything with flexion, extension, straight forward and back. So if you think about it, if you're looking at me in the upper right corner now, think about a pane of glass that just cuts straight through your body, okay? Straight through your body. You put your hands in that pane of glass, you move forward and back, you are moving in the sagittal plane, right? Forward and back, like a lunge, like a tricep extension, a bicep curl, as long as you're facing this, that is in the sagittal plane. Now, the frontal plane is if you were pressed up against the glass, or if you had glass that was cutting your body in half like this, pressed up against the wall, right? You can move like this, right? Move out and around, just like if you had your face pressed up against the wall, okay? Or glass cutting you straight through, that is your adduction and abduction. And then the transverse plane is if something was cutting you in half like this, right? You're a Star Wars fan, how Darth Maul gets chopped out half in the first movie. Those of you who are Star Wars fans, that sounds super nerdy, but it's good. It's a good example. That's in transverse plane. Okay, that's if there's a plane of glass cutting them straight in half like this. How they're moving around in that, how they are twisting, that is going to be the transverse plane. And so, understanding these planes, these axes of rotation, are very, very tedious and tiresome, but they are useful for individuals who are trying to train specific portions of a movement. Past that. And then you also have to remember, like we said, we're talking about combination movements. So bench press, pull up, squat, they are combination movements. At certain points in the movement, you are doing different activities. Are you doing a concentric contraction here, eccentric contraction there? For example, the squat, when you go down, you are eccentrically contracting the quads. And as you go up, you are concentrically contracting the quads. So training those in different capacities is important. You need to understand that if you want to jump really, really high, you probably need to train the concentric portion of that squat to be very, very, very fast and have a high velocity. Now, finally, onto our third term here, reversibility. To use it or lose it. If you don't use a certain system, if you don't use a certain muscle or enzymes, you begin to lose it, because that makes sense. Your body doesn't need it. If the body's not using it, why would it hold on to it? It takes effort and energy. So when you stop training, adaptations stop and will begin to be lost. A few days of no training, you're fine. Has little to no effect. You want to make sure at some point you're giving yourself rest. We'll talk about that a little bit. We talked about that in the last lecture. But just taking a couple of days off is fine. But as you begin to have longer durations, 2 to 3 weeks of no training, you're going to begin to lose strength. And we've all felt this before. You took a month off, you took a 2-month off. This last September, I'd gotten myself through a cut phase. I was down to 7% body fat. I was pretty much at my highest numbers in all of my lifts. And I took 2 weeks off because I got sick. I as most people do, I took myself to a festival, and then a week later I had a friend come down here and I got myself almost no sleep. As you can imagine, you wouldn't if you were at a festival or your friend came down. You guys were spending a weekend in Clearwater Beach, right? I got almost no sleep, and that repressed my immune system, and I got sick, and I was sick for about 2 months. During that 2 months, I had a massive detraining. A lot of my numbers went down 15, 20%. I'm sure we've all experienced this, but this is true for both strength and endurance athletes. You begin to see drops in these things. It's kind of like if you are a basketball player. I remember when I was in high school, I wasn't a particularly talented basketball player. So the only way that I was going to see the court is if I was the hardest working. And so by my senior year, I was seeing the court the entire game, mostly to play defense because of the fact that I wasn't talented. So I got myself in very, very good shape to the point where I was guarding usually their best guard, and I was running the entire game, sprinting, moving around, and I was just an active individual because that's the only way that I was going to be useful and the only way that I would stay on the court. And so I was very, very aerobically inclined for my sport. Now, now if I go play a pickup ball game, if I go up and down the court twice, I'm winning. Okay, if I go up a flight of stairs, I'm winning. Usually I go up to talk to my advisor, three flights of stairs. I usually stand outside his office for about 30 seconds to try to catch my breath so I don't seem like a total fool. But we all have experienced this detraining. When you're no longer using it, you start to lose it. So factors affecting severity detraining, your background, training period, specific muscle groups. So it's going to change a little bit depending on what it is. You're going to lose strength at a lower capacity than you're going to lose lower clip that you're going to lose aerobic capacity. If it's a more type 1 oriented or more type 2 fiber, more type 2 oriented fiber, you're going to see changes in the detraining of that. As well as if you want to maintain these loads, much like people do in the middle of the season through a sport, you see that you don't need to be working that hard. You just need to provide some sort of adequate stimulus to tell the body, hey, we should hold on to these things because we use them. If you're not doing that maintenance training, your body doesn't think that you need it anymore, and it begins to get rid of it, which we have all felt before. So we're looking at this, right? We're looking at training adaptations, see training adaptations over time, and then we'll begin detraining. And what we're looking at here really is that this is a pretty accurate graph in the fact that when you go through those detraining periods, you don't actually just go back to baseline right away. If you detrain for a long period of time, you might see yourself go back near baseline, but you're never really going to go fully back to baseline unless you've only been training for like 2 weeks. Even if I were to never lift a weight again for the next 30 years, if I were to come back and I were to try to curl or bench press, I would imagine that my weight is going to be higher than it was before I had ever trained. Mostly because I was, 14 before I started training, but also in the fact that you just aren't going to always lose all of it. But we see here, you begin to detrain and then you get yourself back and you get retrained. That's why if you go 2 weeks without training or 2 months without training like I did, and you jump back in the gym, it took me 2 years of heavy strength training to get to or 2 or 3 years of heavy strength training to get to the weights that I was at, my peak weights. But when I got really, really back in the training this summer, when I was at my peak, it really only took me like 3 months of a really hard training to get back to my peak again. That's because I had detrained, but because I hadn't detrained all the way, it was much easier to get back up to that original level of fitness. So our fourth principle here is progressive overload. And this is the fable of Milo, Olympic wrestler in Greece, I believe. Essentially what it was is that the fable is that he was a small boy, he was given a calf, and every single day he lifted that calf and he carried it to and from the house or up a mountain or some Greek bullshit that they always tell us, But what happens here is as he got bigger, we see the calf got bigger, as the calf got bigger, he got bigger because as the calf was growing in size, it was becoming heavier, and so it was becoming heavier for him. So his body also had to adapt to grow in size. And now I would imagine that he wasn't carrying a full pound or full grown ox. Obviously, that's probably a lie because a full grown ox is almost 2,000 pounds, which I don't think any human probably could ever lift. But we see here, right, the idea that you need to keep on inducing a greater and greater and greater stimulus in order to keep eliciting adaptations. That's why if you guys are again resistance trained, I hate to use that analogy all the time, it's just the easiest. Lifting, let's say for you fellas, curling 5 pounds, probably not as hard as it used to be. And if you go in the gym and you curl 5 pounds for 3 sets of 10, you're probably not going to see adaptations like you did when you were just starting to lift in high school or whatever it might be. So what we're saying is a training load must increase to elicit adaptations, applies to aerobic and anaerobic exercise. So for a run, those of you who are long distance runners, I'm sure I have some of you in here, maybe some of you are a good runner, you can run a 6-minute mile or whatever it might be. If let's say you can run a 6-minute mile and I said, all right, go out and run a mile, but take 8 minutes, slow down, run 8 minutes. Are you really going to see adaptation from the 8-minute mile? Probably not much. That's probably more of a maintenance thing, but you're probably not going to see gains from the 8-minute mile because you're not stressing the system. You're not having some sort of progressive overload that's that's enabling or stimulating your body to go through a adaptation and to get stronger going forward. As well as we look at this progressive overload requires variation. So we're looking at this, really, this straight line here doesn't occur. Straight line, definitely not the line I drew, it's not straight at all, but that straight line does not occur. You don't just go from baseline to your peak. You need to go in a stepwise manner. So you need to, like we talked about in our fatigue, you need to train and then back off, train, back off, train, back off, train, back off. And you get this rigidity seesaw line going all the way up. If you were to continue to just train hard and harder and harder and harder and harder and harder every single day, you would eventually plateau and you would begin to drop. And so I think I made this analogy in my previous lecture. I don't remember, I recorded it a little while ago, but I remember and I hate to keep using my examples, but these are just real life things that I've learned myself through my stupid nature or my lack of intelligence, right? I'd like to share them with you guys. And so I remember my freshman year, I got to college and I put on a bunch of muscle and got really, really lean. And then the fall of my sophomore year, all of my numbers are plateauing and they started dropping. And so what did I do? I started training even harder. I started doing more volume. I started doing higher intensities, and I began to drop more and more. And I never understood what was going on. And I was overtraining. I was pushing myself way too hard. So the continuum of overtraining or of training. So this is what we're talking about. Continuum of overtraining or of training in general. So you have undertraining, then you have optimal training, you have overreaching. So a little bit of overreaching here is good for some instances. You want to be pushing yourself to the maximal. You don't want to go too far into overreaching because then you're going to begin to have a slippery slope and fall down into overtraining here. And this is obviously just an arbitrary graph, but the idea stands strong is that you want to push yourself, but you don't want to push yourself too hard. And then finally, our fifth principle, we're talking about variation. So periodization. So vary mode, intensity, duration, and frequency based on demands placed on the athlete. So you obviously want to be specific to their sport. You want to be doing things that are going to be used in their sport, but you also need to go through variation. And you need to train. You need to train different types of movement specific orientations, like how fast you're moving it, or changing how heavy it is, changing how often, how much of it you're lifting, right? These are things that you need to modulate and train in a training program in order to keep providing that progressive overload and essentially keep their athlete on their toes, and in essence, where you keep on providing a stimulus for adaptation. The training volume and intensity, again, I've talked about this before, they have an inverse relationship. So as you lift heavier things and you lift them faster, you're going to become fatigued more quickly. So your volume is going to go down. So usually you're trying to find the sweet point, right, with volume and intensity where you can go back and forth. You want to keep the intensity high, but you also want to keep the volume relatively high. And so when you're designing these training programs, you have to remember that if you're doing 90% of your 1RM, you can't lift that as many times as if you're doing 65% of your 1RM, and vice versa. If you're doing 65% of your 1RM, you can probably lift it a lot more times than you could 95% of your 1RM. Those are things you have to keep in mind as a strength practitioner. We'll talk about macrocycles and mesocycles. So macrocycles, we see about about 3 months of training. And then you break the macrocycle down into 4 weeks. And then the microcycle is 7 days. So we see each of these is basically broken in fourths. And what we see here is we see the same pattern. We see the progressive overload and then the back off. And the progressive overload, I don't know why it keeps doing that, I apologize. And then the back off. And the progressive overload and the back off. And essentially we see here, though, is that we are slowly getting higher at each peak that we go through. And so in order to prevent you from overtraining, you have to allow yourself to back off. And so you'll see this a lot with individuals, like let's say UND, my former institution, was very big in hockey. You would have, let's say you would have, like down in the microcycle here, this would be the Monday after a game on the weekend. So to be more specific, hockey in North Dakota or hockey in the country, hockey teams that are D1 play every Friday, Saturday. So we would play, we play Notre Dame, Ohio State, most of the NCHC teams, so like Mankato, Duluth, the really, really premier hockey schools. North Dakota is arguably one of the best hockey schools in the country. So you would see here in the microcycle, the 7 days of training, you would see, like, let's say Monday would be a light training day, Tuesday would be heavier, Wednesday would be even the heaviest, and then they would drop off for Thursday, and then they probably wouldn't even train Friday or Saturday. But the principle stays strong here. We see both in the macrocycle, we see in the mesocycle, the 4 weeks training, and then in the individual week of training, that you are providing some sort of overload, and then you back off, overload, back off, and so on and so forth. This is just further broken down so you can visualize macrocycle, mesocycle, microcycle, and then your individual training days. And then we see here, we see our macrocycles in this dark tan, the mesocycles in the light blue, and then our microcycles. And you see this variation. We've seen this before, the step-by-step manner, the little increase, decrease, where you slowly get to your goal. In a classic periodization model, we're going to go through what these phases right here. We're not going to get super into these. But essentially what you're saying is that you're seeing volume, intensity, and skill of the training are going to come to some sort of peak, and then volume is going to drop. You don't want to tire out your athletes. Again, because this isn't super important for exercise physiology, I'm not going to go into this in greater detail, but this is generally how the classic periodization model is written. Now, tapering for peak performance, right? You want to make sure that you are tapering off. You want to make sure that you are not providing some sort of heavy stimulus. As you can imagine, if you, let's say, have a volleyball game on Saturday, you want to make sure that your hardest training day is not on Friday, because then you'll probably be tired for your game on Saturday. And so I thought it was always silly in high school when we would play football, or sometimes our heaviest training days, our heaviest conditioning days, or the day before the game, because they wanted to prepare us. They want to get you prepped. You know, if you train, here's what if you train hard enough on Thursday, that'll make Friday seem easier, right? No, that's silly. And I wish I could go back and slap some of my football coaches, because they just didn't know anything. They just listened to what they were told. It's no fault of their own. They listened to what they were told when they were young, and they just never did any research on it. But obviously, as exercise has evolved and it's becoming more of an actual scientific field, we're beginning to understand how to optimize these things for our athletes as well. So we talked about linear periodization is exactly what we talked about just before this. And then nonlinear is a little bit of a different take. So this is becoming a little bit more popular, specifically within sports, because you can't keep this linear model within sport all the time. You know, some sports, baseball, volleyball, basketball, you play on different days of the week. And so you can't just keep this linear model, because you might have 2 days in between your game, or you might have 5 days in between your games. And so this nonlinear model has become a little bit more popular, where essentially you're basing the technique and intensity off of the volume and using it to determine or using the time in between exercise, or excuse me, using the time in between your sporting outing to determine which one of these you're doing. If you have a long amount of time between your sporting outing, then you can work out a little bit more intensely. And if you have a short period, like maybe a couple of days, you're working out less intensely. So the recovery seesaw, okay? Training, climbing, life stress. Something very, very important for recovery is you need to have these things. You need to have sleep, easy activity, water, naps, nutrients, proper macronutrients, micronutrients, everything. You need to make sure, because if you are training too hard, and you are putting yourself through too much stress, you're going to see the teeter-totter begin to tip this way, okay? You want to keep these things in balance. So looking at signs that you're overtraining, these are kind of like broad, not obvious. They're kind of broad. Lost performance, excessive soreness. Like I said, I remember when I was going through my overtraining period, before I even figured out that I was overtraining, I was seeing massive loss in performance. I was seeing a lack of appetite, which was crazy to me. I was seeing nagging injuries. I would go to the gym and I would get like a nagging injury in my arm or in my leg. A good example, again, I don't know if you used this in the last lecture or not, but when I was playing baseball, club baseball in college, I was working out, and then I was also pitching a lot. And I was usually our Friday guy, our number one guy. And so I would be pitching the most out of anybody. And so what I found is that I started to have a really nagging injury in my bicep, specifically in my humerus, and it just was not going away. And it did not go away until I took about a month off of all the training and all throwing, that when I went back to the gym, the injury, quote unquote injury, was actually gone, because I allowed myself to rest, because I was overtraining so severely. So overtraining is decreased performance or negative adaptations that are due to improper load or recovery. So it can be related to training stress or other stressors in your life. Functional overreaching can be beneficial. So remember I talked about that. You can have a little bit of overreaching that can be beneficial, but once it becomes too extreme, it becomes detrimental. It's just like anything in your life. Obviously, if you are lifting a certain load, let's say you're lifting a certain weight is good for you. But if you lift a weight that's too heavy, it can hurt you. Same idea here. If you are training too often, too intensely, you're not allowing your body to recover. It's going to begin to provide detriment to your performance. And we obviously don't want that in sport. We'll skip past that. You guys can take a kind of look at these overtraining syndrome. So when you're doing this, you can monitor for overtraining. So there's a few different ways you can do this. There's some that are becoming more popular in literature, some that are becoming less popular in literature, depending on what we're looking at. But what we will see with a lot of overtraining individuals is that you will see that they will have higher resting heart rate or blood pressure. So if you have somebody that's really, really healthy, really, really inclined, and they usually have, let's say, a heart rate of like 55, you put them through this vigorous training program, and you come back and their resting heart rate is like 65, you might be overtraining them a little bit, as well as obviously you can track the drop in performance. Their RPE, their rating of perceived exertion, will usually go up with each bout. We've all had that where we go into the gym and we lift a weight and it just feels heavier that day for whatever reason. Or we run a mile and oh my God, it's just dragging that day. It feels so hard. And I'm not saying you're necessarily overtraining, but you might be on your way there. Another thing we can look at is heart rate variability. And so I think I'll talk about that in a second here in a little bit more detail. But essentially what heart rate variability is as you inhale and as you exhale, there are natural changes in your heart rate. And so if that heart rate variability is going down, if that natural change in your heart rate is going down, it is likely because your heart is just continuing to work hard because it's just trying to recover so much. As well as overtraining, you see psychological motivation go down. I remember when I was going through my overtraining period, I began to actually hate going to the gym. I loved it. It was super fun my freshman year. I was seeing these gains. I was enjoying seeing the friends. And then my sophomore year, it took a lot, and I started taking a lot of pre-workout for that. Luckily, I cycled off of that stuff. I'm not super addicted to caffeine anymore. But in order to get myself to go, because my motivation was so low, I had to have some sort of stimulant like caffeine, as well as trouble sleeping. I know myself again had trouble sleeping. I know a lot of people have gone through overtraining, have trouble sleeping. You see a lot of people. You see like the show Surviving the Cut, which is a show about people going through Navy SEAL training, Marine sniper training. A lot of those individuals, when they are in the peak physiological demanding era of their training, the first 2 weeks, they at times, or excuse me, not the first 2 weeks, the second and third week, they will at times have trouble sleeping because they're so overtrained. And during that period, you'll see injuries and illness, and you'll see increase in heart rate recovery. And so what that means is that your heart rate recovery, okay, when you recover to your specific baseline level, the recovery is not as efficient as it was previously. Let me skip over this here. Talk about that. So using this, right, heart rate variability, it's a little bit more individualized. So it's more sensitive than other measures like resting heart rate. So we can use heart rate variability to more efficiently, more accurately measure the overtraining effect on individual people. So each person has a normal heart rate variability zone. Take it the first thing in the morning or while sleeping. So you can take this at baseline and then take it as you're going through a training period or as you go through a season to modulate and monitor how your athletes are doing. And so the University of North Dakota, again, the hockey team, they did this because you play every Friday, Saturday, you're training all the time, you're traveling all the time. They want to make sure that their athletes are at tip top shape. And so they would monitor heart rate variability throughout the season to modulate whether or not they should be training hard in between their weekend games. So you can use a variety of different things. We got Fitbits, Fitbits, I guess. Fitbits, Apple Watches. That'll be good mess up for the recording here. But you have Apple Watches. You have a whole bunch of different watches. Whoop. I know there's a bunch of different things that are popular. These are all different tools that you can use to measure heart rate variability, measure your training, measure your heart rate. They're all very, very prevalent and available to everyone, and very, very common in today's literature. And we're gonna skip over this too. So summary, right? For summary, we have our 5 principles: we have individuality, specificity, reversibility, progressive overload, and periodization. And overtraining can lead to a decrease in performance, and a variety of tools can be used to monitor it. And so with all these things, this is essentially saying, okay, now you know the physiology. How are we applying it to our individuals? And what are the reasons, or what are the fundamental aspects that we are following certain principles and how are we applying those to our training program. And so this is going to be the fifth and final lecture before you guys' exam. Like I said at the beginning, I'll be scheduling a Zoom session at some point for us to go over and review things. And then again, this is your final chance to reach out to me and ask questions. If you are a personal trainer or you're an athletic trainer, you want to know a little bit more about this stuff, I can always help you out. I apologize that I glossed over it a little bit here. I just feel like it's not as important for an exercise physiology course. But so far, I hope you guys are really enjoying the course. I've enjoyed preparing this material for you. I enjoy and I love talking about this stuff. Like I said, I'm extremely passionate. Whether or not you can tell or not, but these are things that I love talking about and going forward. I hope you guys enjoy the class and continue to learn as much as you can. Have a good one.